Und jetzt geht's weiter. Wie damals, als wir noch Joscha Bach geguckt haben zusammen.
Current Boston Dynamics robots, it doesn't look as if there is somebody pulling the strings. It doesn't look like cheating anymore.
Okay, so let's go there because I got to talk to you about this. So obviously, with the case of Boston Dynamics, as you may or may not know, it's always either hard-coded or remote controlled. There's no intelligence.
So, I don't know how the current generation of Boston Dynamics robots works, but what I've been told about the previous ones was that it's basically all cybernetic control, which means you still have feedback mechanisms and so on, but it's not deep learning for the most part as it's currently done.
Mhm.
It's for the most part just identifying a control hierarchy that is congruent to the limbs that exist and the parameters that need to be optimized for the movement of these limbs, and then there is a convergence progress. So it's basically just regression that you would need to control this. But again, I don't know whether that's true. That's just what I've been told about how they work.
Also, diese Boston Dynamics Roboter sind wirklich kybernetische Dinger. Ne? Das ist einfach Regelungstechnik in dem Sinne. Da steckt quasi noch kein maschinelles Lernen drin, in dem Sinne, wie wir uns das vorstellen würden, wenn die sagen, dass sie maschinelles Lernen verwenden. Ne? Die verwenden maschinelles Lernen einfach nur, um ihre Parameter zu optimieren. So wie dieser Typ, der seinen herzzerreißenden TED-Talk gemacht hat über die Prothesen, die er sich baut. Der hat irgendwie dem wurden die Beine amputiert und dann hat er irgendwie 20 Jahre gegrindet und hat sich Prothesen gebaut, die richtig krass sind. Und da verwendet er auch maschinelles Lernen irgendwie.
We have to separate several levels of discussion here. So the only thing they do is pretty sophisticated control with no machine learning
Ja.
in order to be to maintain balance or to right itself. It's a control problem in terms of using the actuators to, when it's pushed or when it steps on a thing that's uneven, how to always maintain balance.
Yes.
And there's a tricky set of heuristics around that, but that's the only goal. Everything you see Boston Dynamics doing in terms of that to us humans is compelling, which is any kind of higher order movement, like turning, wiggling its butt, jumping back on its 2 feet, dancing. Dancing is even worse because dancing is hard coded in. It's choreographed by humans. There's choreography software. So there is no, of all that high level movement, there's no anything that
Einfach
you can
auswendig
call,
gelernt.
certainly can't call AI.
Ja.
There's no even basic heuristics. It's all hard coded in, and yet we humans immediately project agency onto them, which is fascinating.
So the gap here is it doesn't necessarily have
Ja,
agent.
wenn wir einen Film gucken, fiebern wir ja auch mit. Und wenn wir ein Buch lesen, fiebern wir ja auch mit, obwohl wir wissen, dass es gar nicht existiert in Wahrheit.
What it has is cybernetic control. And the cybernetic control means you have a hierarchy of feedback loops that keep the behavior in certain boundaries so the robot doesn't fall over and it's able to perform the movements. And
Also, was er damit meint ist, ne? Joscha Bachs Standardbeispiel ist ja eigentlich immer das Thermostat, um so einen Kontrollmechanismus mal zu erklären, ne? Und ein Thermostat hat ja einen Messfühler im einfachsten Fall und einfach nur eine Regelung, die heizt oder nicht heizt. Ne? Und in erster Ordnung gibt es einen Sollwert und einen Ist-Wert an diesem Messfühler. Und wenn das zu kalt ist, dann macht es die Heizung an und wenn es zu warm ist, macht es die Heizung wieder aus. So. Und das ist sozusagen in erster Ordnung ein regelungstechnisches Problem, was man da löst damit. Ne? Weil sich das Ding selber regelt. Hin zu dem Sollwert. So, und wenn man jetzt ein komplizierteres, also wenn man jetzt zum Beispiel feststellt, okay, der Messfühler ist mitten im Raum, aber das, was er misst, muss nicht zwangsläufig repräsentativ für die gesamte Raumtemperatur sein. Könnte man vielleicht Modelle schaffen, die das korrigieren, diesen Messfehler. Dann könnte man sozusagen kompliziertere Modelle in dieses Modell, also in diese Regelung mit einbauen. Und dabei erweitert man sozusagen die Komplexität von diesem Kontrollproblem. So, und Lex Fridman und Joscha Bach sagt dann meistens sowas wie, naja, und wenn man das jetzt beliebig kompliziert macht, die komplette Physik reintut und alles Mögliche tut, dann hat man irgendwann eine AGI da sitzen, die einfach nur die Raumtemperatur konstant halten soll. Aber das ist ein klassisches Kontrollproblem. Und was die Roboter von Boston Dynamics für ein Kontrollproblem haben, ist wahrscheinlich sowas wie, sie haben Gyrometer und sie wissen ungefähr, sie können ausrechnen, wie der Roboter steht und er soll einfach nur optimieren, nicht hinzufallen oder so. Das ist im Prinzip vergleichbar damit, weil man kann halt das messen und dann gibt es einen Sollwert und einen Ist-Wert und dann wird halt sozusagen, ja, eine komplette, sozusagen, was er sagt, Hierarchies of Feedback Loops, also ineinander verschachtelte, mehr oder weniger mächtige Rückkopplungsschleifen, die sich die ganze Zeit gegenseitig kontrollieren und messen. Und dabei sozusagen ein Kontrollparadigma innehaben, was im Prinzip dazu führt, dass diese Maschinen da sich richtig bewegen und nicht hinfallen und so. Na, weil auch hinfallen müsste ja was sein, was die Maschine bemerken muss.
Choreography cannot really happen with motion capture because the robot would fall over because the physics of the robot, the weight distribution and so on, is different from the weight distribution in the human body. So if you were using the directly motion captured movements of a human body to project it into this robot, it wouldn't work. You can do this with a computer animation. It will look a little bit off, but who cares? But if you want to correct for the physics, you need to basically tell the robot where it should move its limbs, and then the control algorithm is going to approximate a solution that makes it possible within the physics of the robot.
Ja, weil die Beine und so von den Dingern eine andere Massenverteilung haben, würden die, wenn sie sich bewegen würden wie wir, einfach hinfallen. Ne, deswegen müssen die eigene Lösungen finden zu dem Problem, tanz mal ein bisschen. Und dann versucht der Roboter so zu tanzen wie wir mit der Nebenbedingung, dass er für seine Massenverteilung nicht hinfällt dabei.
And you have to find the basic solution for making that happen, and there's probably going to be some regression necessary to get the control architecture to make these movements.
But those two layers are separate. So
Yes.
the thing, the higher level instruction of how you should move and where you should move is
Yeah,
a
so I
higher level.
expect that the control level of these robots at some level is dumb. This is just the physical control movement, the motor architecture. But it's a relatively smart motor architecture. It's just that there is no high-level deliberation about what decisions to make necessarily, right?
But see,
So-
it doesn't feel like free will or
No,
consciousness.
that was not where I was trying to get to. I think that in our own
Lex
body, we
Fridman
have
will
that too.
vorzucken.
So we have a certain thing that is basically just a cybernetic control architecture that is moving our limbs. And deep learning can help in discovering such an architecture if you don't have it in the first place. If you already know your hardware, you can maybe handcraft it. But if you don't know your hardware, you can search for such an architecture. And this work already existed in the 80s and 90s. People were starting to search for control architectures by motor babbling and so on, and just use reinforcement learning architectures to discover such a thing. And now imagine that you have this cybernetic control architecture already inside of you. And you extend this a little bit. So you are seeking out food, for instance, or rest, and so on. And you get to have a baby at some point. And now you add more and more control layers to this. And the system is reverse engineering its own control architecture and builds a high-level model to synchronize the pursuit of very different conflicting goals. And this is how I think you get to purposes. Purposes are models of your goals. The goals may be intrinsic as the result of the different setpoint violations that you have.
Wir machen nochmal zurück. Ich war kurz abgelenkt mit Bier eingießen und das hat mich direkt rausgeworfen. Weil was er da gerade erklärt hat, ist super geil.
Motor architecture. It's just that there is no high-level deliberation about what decisions to make necessarily, right?
But see,
So-
it doesn't feel like free will or
No,
consciousness.
that was not where I was trying to get to. I think that in our own body, we have that too. So we have a certain thing that is basically just a cybernetic control architecture that is moving our limbs. And
Erste Feststellung. Unser präfrontaler Kortex ist das wahrscheinlich, ne? Der macht das hier mit unserer Bewegung und so. Das ist eine von diesen Layers in dem sozusagen in dieser Kontrollhierarchie. Ne? Und von irgendwoher müssen sozusagen die Steuerbefehle kommen, die übersetzt werden müssen, damit der Kortex diese Signale lesen kann. Und dann sozusagen muss der Kortex die Signale umsetzen in Signale, die dann sozusagen hier meine Hand steuern und so.
deep learning can help in discovering such an architecture if you don't have it in the first place.
Genau. Und wenn man jetzt quasi, also Deep Learning müsst ihr euch vorstellen, was das macht ist, ihr gebt einen Satz von Inputs und Outputs und ihr wisst nicht, wie die Funktion ist, die dazwischen, die das mappt. Dann kann Deep Learning einen Funktionsapproximator, also es gibt ja diesen Spruch sozusagen vom universellen Funktionsapproximator, ich gebe dir ganz viele X und ganz viele Ys, ne? Und ich sage, f von x ist gleich y und f ist gesucht. Ich kenne die Funktion nicht. Ich weiß nur, was die Inputs und die Outputs sind. Dann kann ich mit Deep Learning eine Art Schätzung machen für das f. Und wenn meine Netzwerkarchitektur vom Deep Learning, also die Knoten, wie die miteinander vernetzt sind, wenn das hinreichend offen ist, findet Deep Learning immer eine Lösung. Das heißt immer eine Approximation für meine unbekannte Funktion f. Und er sagt jetzt, okay, wenn wir schon die Inputs und Outputs da haben, dann kann uns Deep Learning helfen, die konkrete Architektur zu finden, die dieses Steuerungsproblem löst, wenn wir es nicht kennen.
Already know your hardware, you can maybe handcraft it. But if you don't know your hardware, you can search for such an architecture. And this work already existed in the 80s and 90s. People were starting to search for control architectures by motor babbling and so on, and just use reinforcement learning architectures to discover such a thing. And now imagine that you have the cybernetic control architecture already inside of you. And you extend this a little bit. So you are seeking out food, for instance, or rest.
Genau, jetzt kommen sozusagen kompliziertere Befehle an den Cortex herangetragen. Also eigentlich nicht an den Cortex, sondern an ein Level höher. Wenn jetzt sozusagen mein Befehl lautet, ich will jetzt nicht mein rechtes Bein bewegen, sondern ich will auf den Berg da hochsteigen, dann ist das ja eine kompliziertere Kaskade von mehr motorischen Befehlen. Und jetzt geht es ihm sozusagen darum, das zu beschreiben.
So on, and you get to have a baby at some point. And now you add more and more control layers to this. And the system is reverse engineering its own control architecture and builds a high-level model.
Und Reverse Engineering, damit meint er diesen Deep Learning-Prozess. Ne? Das System muss erstmal selber herausfinden, wie es gebaut ist. Ne? Also wir, wenn wir Motorik lernen als Babys, reverse engineeren unser eigenes Signal Processing. Wir brauchen ein Modell davon, damit wir es anschließend steuern können.
To synchronize the pursuit of very different conflicting goals. And this is how I think you get to purposes. Purposes are models of your goals. The goals may be intrinsic as the result of the different set point violations that you have, hunger and thirst for very different things, and rest and pain avoidance and so on. And you put all these things together and eventually you need to come up with a strategy to synchronize them all.
Genau, also wir haben verschiedene Bedürfnisse, ne? Die wollen wir alle irgendwie gleichzeitig mehr oder weniger auch befriedigen, aber wir brauchen erstmal eine entsprechende Heuristik, die uns sagt, wann was jetzt besonders dolle wichtig ist. Ne, wenn wir gerade genug getrunken haben, dann brauchen wir halt nicht noch mehr trinken zum Beispiel. Dann können wir anfangen, uns über das Kratzen am Sack nachzudenken, zum Beispiel.
And you don't need just to do this alone by yourself, because we are state-building organisms. We cannot function in isolation the way that Homo sapiens is set up. So our own behavior only makes sense when you zoom out very far into a society or even into ecosystemic intelligence on the planet and our place in it. So the individual behavior only makes sense in these larger contexts. And we have a number of priors built into us, so we are behaving as if we were acting on these high-level goals pretty much right from the start. And eventually in the course of our life, we can reverse engineer the goals that we're acting on, what actually are our higher level purposes. And the more we understand that, the more our behavior makes sense. But this is all, at this point, complex stories within stories that are driving our behavior.
Yeah, I just don't know how big of a leap it is to start create a system that's able to tell stories within stories. Like how big of a leap that is from where currently Boston Dynamics is, or any robot that's operating in the physical space. That leap might be big if it requires to solve the hard problem of consciousness, which is telling a hell of a good story.
I suspect that consciousness itself is relatively simple. What's hard is perception and the interface between perception and reasoning. There's, for instance, the idea of the consciousness prior that would be built into such a system by Joscha Bengio. And what he describes, and I think that's accurate, is that our own model of the world can be described through something like an energy function. The energy function is modeling the contradictions that exist within the model at any given point. And you try to minimize these contradictions, the tangents in the model. And to do this, you need to sometimes test things. You need to conditionally disambiguate figure and ground. You need to distinguish whether this is true or that is true, and so on. Eventually, you get to an interpretation, but you will need to manually depress a few points in your model to let it snap into a state that makes sense. And this function that tries to get the biggest dip in the energy function in your model, according to Joscha Bengio, is related to consciousnness. It's a low-dimensional discrete function that tries to maximize this dip in the energy function.
I think I would need to dig into.
Ja, also er hat jetzt sozusagen das nochmal alternativ formuliert, dass das Bewusstsein ein Resultat daraus ist, dass wir einfach nur finde ich, ist eine merkwürdige Formulierung, aber er hat ja auch nicht gesagt, das ist nicht seine eigene Formulierung. Wir haben halt unsere Messwerte, unsere Beobachtung, ne, und wir brauchen ein Modell, das die erklärt. Und wenn wir das Minimierungsproblem lösen wollen, dass unser Modell zu unseren Messwerten am bestmöglichsten passt, das ist das, was wir sozusagen machen. Wir versuchen, ein Modell zu erzeugen, was konsistent mit unseren Beobachtungen ist. Und das nennt er diese Energy Function, ne?
Details, because I think the way he uses the word consciousness is more akin to like self-awareness, like modeling yourself within the world, as opposed to the subjective experience, the hard problem.
No, it's not even the self within the world. The self is the agent and you don't need to be aware of yourself in order to be conscious.
Wie meinst du, das entwickelt sich aus uns heraus? Naja, also diese Sache mit dem Kontrollmodell, was ich schon gesagt habe, ne? Wir haben das Kontrollmodell quasi, bloß unsere Kontrolle ist nicht einfach nur ein Thermostat. Bei uns emergiert die Kontrolle daraus, dass unser System Vorhersagen trifft, was als nächstes für Inputdaten reinkommen werden. Wir wollen so gut, also das Ziel unseres Gehirns, unserer Datenverarbeitung ist, AFK gehen zu können und nicht mehr überrascht zu werden durch die Inputdaten. Die Inputdaten sollen vorhersagbar werden. Und während wir das sozusagen erlernen und ein physikalisches Modell, also ein Modell der Welt, uns konstruieren, in dem irgendwie kausale Zusammenhänge stattfinden, damit wir nicht mehr so viel überrascht sind, stellen wir fest, dass wir selber Agents davon sind. Wir können selber eingreifen in die Vorhersagen, indem ich irgendwas tue, zum Beispiel. Damit beeinflusse ich ja meine Vorhersagegenauigkeit, wenn ich etwas tue. Ich stelle also fest, wenn ich eingreife, kriege ich bessere Predictions. Mein System wird sozusagen, kommt seinem Ziel einen Schritt näher, wenn meine Predictions besser werden. Und daraus entsteht dieses Kontrollparadigma. Ich habe ja Kontrolle über meinen eigenen Körper. Der ist ja Teil des Modells dieser Welt. Aus diesem Kontrollparadigma, im Übrigen, denke ich, entsteht später auch Wettbewerb. Weil, wenn zwei solche Agents aufeinandertreffen, müssen die sich erstmal synchronisieren. Die müssen erstmal voneinander Theory of Mind machen, um miteinander reinzugucken und machen da ein Modell von dem anderen. Der andere weiß auch, dass der andere sich ein Modell von dir selbst macht und so. Macht sich gegenseitig Modelle voneinander und dann muss man sozusagen versuchen, Trust zu optimieren. Ne? Weil, wenn man sich überhaupt nicht kennt, dann hat man ja kein Vertrauen zueinander, so nach dem Motto. Und daraus entsteht dann später die Sache mit dem Gefangenendilemma und dem Wettbewerb. Aber er hat jetzt ja einfach nur gesagt, wo dieser Joshua, irgendwas mit B, nicht Joscha Bach, sondern der andere, Bengio oder so, wie der erklärt, wo das Consciousness herkommt. Und er sagt, das ist ein Nebenprodukt von dieser Optimierung von dieser Energiefunktion. Das ist sein Modell.
Self is just a particular content that you can have, but you don't have to have. Right? You can be conscious in, for instance, a dream at night or during a meditation state where you don't have a self.
Right.
Where you're just aware of the fact that you are aware. And what we mean by consciousness in the colloquial sense is largely this reflexive self-awareness. That we become aware of the fact that we are paying attention. That we are the thing that pays attention.
We are the thing that pays attention, right. I don't see where the awareness that we're aware, the hard problem doesn't feel like it's solved. I mean, it's called a hard problem for a reason, because it seems like there needs to be a major leap.
Also er nennt es das Hard Problem of Consciousness, weil das viele sagen, ne? Allen voran David Chalmers sagt das so gerne. Hard Problem of Consciousness.
Yeah, I think the major leap is to understand how it is possible that a machine can dream, that a physical system is able to create a representation that the physical system is acting on, and that is spun force and so on. But once you accept the fact that you are not in physics, but that you exist inside of the story, I think the mystery disappears. Everything is possible in a
We
story.
exist inside the story. Okay, so
Your
the machine-
consciousness is being written into the story. The fact that you experience things is written into the story. You ask yourself, is this real what I'm seeing? And your brain writes into the story, yes, it's real.
So what about the perception of consciousness? So to me, you look conscious. So the illusion of consciousness, the demonstration of consciousness. I ask for the legged robot. How do we make this legged robot conscious? So there's two things, and maybe you can tell me if they're neighboring ideas. One is actually make it conscious, and the other is make it appear conscious to others. Are those related?
Let's ask it from the other direction. What would it take to make you not conscious? So when you are thinking about how you perceive the world, can you decide to switch from looking at qualia to looking at representational states? And it turns out you can.
Yeah.
There is a particular way in which you can look at the world and recognize its machine nature, including your own. And in that state, you don't have that conscious experience in this way anymore. It becomes apparent as a representation. Everything becomes opaque. And I think this thing that you recognize everything as a representation, this is typically what we mean with enlightenment states.
Mhm.
Also er redet jetzt von irgendwelchen Psychedelika oder Meditation wahrscheinlich. Wahrscheinlich redet er von Meditation, ne?
And
Yeah,
it
so
can
through
happen on the
meditation, all that-
motivational level, but you can also do this on the experiential level, on the perceptual level.
See, but then I can come back to a conscious state. Okay, I'm referring to the social aspect, that the demonstration of consciousness is a really nice thing at a party when you're trying to meet a new person. It's a nice thing to know that they're conscious, and they can I don't know how fundamental consciousness is in human interaction, but it seems like to be at least an important part. And I ask that in the same kind of way for robots. You know, in order to create a rich, compelling human-robot interaction, it feels like there needs to be elements of consciousness within that interaction.
My cat is obviously conscious. And so my cat can do this party trick. She also knows that I am conscious. We're able to have feedback about the fact that we are both acting on models of our own awareness.
The question is, how hard is it for the robot, artificially created robot, to achieve cat level and party tricks?
Yes, so the issue for me is currently not so much on how to build a system that creates a story about a robot that lives in the world, but to make an adequate representation of the world. And the model that you and me have is a unified one. It's one where you basically make sense of everything that you can perceive. Every feature in the world that enters your perception can be relationally mapped to a unified model of everything. And we don't have an AI that is able to construct such a unified model yet.
So you need that unified model to do the party trick?
Yes, I think that it doesn't make sense if this thing is conscious but not in the same universe as you, because you could not relate to each other.
So what's the process, would you say, of engineering consciousness?
Das heißt, die Maschine braucht ein richtig gutes Weltmodell. Das meint er damit, ne? Und was nicht reicht, ist, der Maschine die Quantenmechanik rüberreichen. Es braucht diese High-Level-Abstractions, objektorientierte Sachen, Geometrie und so. Unsere Heuristiken, dass wir sagen, okay, da gibt es einen Unterschied, das hier ist eine Katze, da hinten ist ein Stuhl und so. Und ja, wie bei Babys auch, das dauert ein bisschen. Und wahrscheinlich ist sozusagen, ich denke, Joscha Bach würde auch hergehen und es genauso versuchen zu implementieren, ne? Also Surprisal minimieren als Kostenfunktion, die irgendwie optimiert werden soll. Und dann die verschiedenen Abstraction Layers einfach sich selbst lösen lassen per Reinforcement oder so. Und er hat ja gesagt, das Problem ist sozusagen eigentlich nicht, wie man das Consciousness da reincodet, sondern er hat gesagt, das Problem sind die Representations. Ne? Und in der Bilderkennungssache, da hat mich zum Beispiel das Capsule Learning total überzeugt damals. Na, man hat diese normalen, auf Faltungskernen basierenden Strukturen, diese CNNs, Convolutional Neuronal Networks. Das sind die einfach nur sozusagen, ja, 2D-Bilddaten mehr oder weniger kriegen und dann so lange Faltungskerne drauf abbilden, um Features zu abstrahieren und dann Bilderkennung damit zu betreiben. Und was da einen richtigen Boost gebracht hat, ist, wenn man dem System die Möglichkeit gibt, also wenn man die Architektur so wählt, dass es so aussieht, als könnte das System Objekte vorher voneinander trennen. Sodass man quasi Objektorientierung zulässt in dem Regressionsmodell, was ja dann das Deep Learning von alleine finden wird. Und das hat einen richtigen Boost gebracht irgendwie. Ne? Also, dass man dem Modell quasi, dass man dem Deep Learning-Ding schon vorher sagt, es gibt verschiedene Dinge. Du musst nur noch rausfinden, welche. Und dann füllt es sozusagen die ganzen neuronalen Gewichte selber dabei beim Lernprozess. Capsule Learning heißt das. Könnt ihr ja mal gucken, wenn euch das interessiert. Wenn ihr ein bisschen Ahnung davon habt, wisst ihr es wahrscheinlich schon. Ne?
So,
das ist wahrscheinlich irgendwie zweites Semester oder so. Wenn man jetzt irgendwie Computer Vision oder Machine Learning oder irgendwie sowas hat an der Uni, denke ich, da ist das sind alle Standard-Use-Cases mittlerweile. Die werden wahrscheinlich alle in den Einführungsveranstaltungen durchgekaspert. Gerade weil CNNs so eine einfache mathematische Struktur haben, in Anführungsstrichen.
Probably want to have some kind of perceptual system. This perceptual system is a processing agent that is able to track sensory data and predict the next frame in the sensory data from the previous frames of the sensory data and the current state of the system. So the current state of the system is, in perception, instrumental to predicting what happens next.
Mhm.
And this means you build lots and lots of functions that take all the blips that you feel on your skin and that you see on your retina or that you hear and puts them into a set of relationships that allows you to predict what kind of sensory data, what kind of sensor of blips, vector of blips you're going to perceive in the next frame, right? This is tuned and it's constantly tuned until it gets as accurate as it can.
You build a very accurate prediction mechanism that is step one of the perception. So first you predict, then you perceive and see the error in your prediction.
And you have to do two things to make that happen. One is you have to build a network of relationships that are constraints that take all the variance in the world, put each of the variances into a variable that is connected with relationships to other variables. And these relationships are computable functions that constrain each other. So when you see a nose that points in a certain direction in space, you have a constraint that says there should be a face nearby that has the same direction, right? And if that is not the case, you have some kind of contradiction that you need to resolve because it's probably not a nose what you're looking at. It just looks like one. So you have to reinterpret the data and until you get to a point.
Und sein Standardbeispiel ist immer der Tiger, ne? Also, wenn jetzt auf der Straße einem ein Tiger entgegenkommt, der einen fressen will, dann muss das perzeptuelle System noch in der Lage sein, festzustellen, ey, das ist sehr unwahrscheinlich, dass es jetzt so wirklich ein Tiger ist, aber es ist ein Tiger und ich muss wegrennen. Das ist immer sein Standardding eigentlich, ne?
Point where your model converges. And this process of making the sensory data fit into your model structure is what Piaget calls the assimilation. And accommodation is the change of the models, where you change your model in such a way that you can assimilate everything.
So you're talking about building a hell of an awesome perception system that's able to do prediction and perception and correct and keep improving.
Wait, just
there's more.
Yes, there's more. So the first thing that we wanted to do is we want to minimize the contradictions in the model.
Yes.
And of course, it's very easy to make a model in which you minimize the contradictions just by allowing that it can be in many, many possible states, right? So if you increase the degrees of freedom, you will have fewer contradictions. But you also want to reduce the degrees of freedom because degrees of freedom mean uncertainty. You want your model to reduce uncertainty as much as possible. But reducing uncertainty is expensive. So you have to have a trade-off between minimizing contradictions and reducing uncertainty. And you have only a finite amount of compute and experimental time and effort available to reduce uncertainty in the world. So you need to assign value to what you observe. So you need some kind of motivational system that is estimating what you should be looking at and what you should be thinking about it, how you should be applying your resources to model what that is. Right? So you need to have something like convergence links that tell you how to get from the present state of the model to the next one. You need to have these compatibility links that tell you which constraints exist and which constraint violations exist. And you need to have some kind of motivational system that tells you what to pay attention to. So now we have a second agent next to the perceptual agent. We have a motivational agent. This is a cybernetic system that is modeling what the system needs, what's important for the system, and that interacts with the perceptual system to maximize the expected reward.
Ne, also er versucht jetzt sozusagen die verschiedenen Kontrollinstanzen hier zu skizzieren und was die sozusagen intern für eine Kostenfunktion, also was die für eine Zielfunktion optimieren.
And you're saying the motivational system is some kind of, like, what is it, a higher level narrative over some lower level?
No, it's just your brainstem stuff, the limbic system stuff that tells you, okay, now you should get something to eat because I've just measured your blood sugar.
So you mean like motivational system, like the lower level stuff,
Yes.
like hungry?
Yes, but there's basically physiological needs and some cognitive needs and some social needs, and they all interact. And they're all implemented at different parts in your nervous system as the motivational system. But they're basically cybernetic feedback loops. It's not that complicated. It's just a lot of code. And so you now have a motivational agent that makes your robot go for the ball, or that makes your worm go to eat food, and so on. And you have the perceptual system that lets it predict that environment, so it's able to solve that control problem to some degree. And now what we learned is that it's very hard to build a machine learning system that looks at all the data simultaneously to see what kind of relationships could exist between them. So you need to selectively model the world. You need to figure out, where can I make the biggest difference if I would put the following things together? Sometimes you find a gradient for that, right? When you have a gradient, you don't need to remember where you came from. You just follow the gradient until it doesn't get any better. But if you have a world where the problems are discontinuous and the search spaces are discontinuous, you need to retain memory of what you explored. And you need to construct a plan of what to explore next. And this thing that means that you have, next to this perceptual construction system and the motivational cybernetics, an agent that is paying attention to what it should select at any given moment to maximize reward. And this scanning system, this attention agent, is required for consciousness. And consciousness is its control model. So it's the indexed memories that this thing retains when it manipulates the perceptual representations to maximize the value and minimize the conflicts in it to increase coherence. So the purpose of consciousness is to create coherence in your perceptual representations, remove conflicts, predict the future, construct counterfactual representations so you can coordinate your actions and so on. And in order to do this, it needs to form memories. These memories are partial binding states of the working memory contents that are being revisited later on to backtrack, to undo certain states, to look for alternatives. And these indexed memories that you can recall, that is what you perceive as your stream of consciousness. And being able to recall these memories, this is what makes you conscious. If you could not remember what you paid attention to, you wouldn't be conscious.
Exakt. Ja, also, das ist übrigens auch so eine Sache, ne, mit der Erinnerung. Da denke ich auch öfter mal drüber nach, so, dass das ja eigentlich so ein übelst krasses Ding ist, ne? Also, was mich zum Beispiel beim extremen Saufen immer angekotzt hat, ist, wenn ich am nächsten Tag nicht mehr wusste, was passiert ist. Das ist nämlich das Gleiche, als wäre es gar nicht passiert. Nur andere Leute erzählen dir dann, was du für einen Scheiß gebaut hast und so. Das ist aber voll krass, ne? Und deswegen denkt man, ist ja sozusagen auch die normale Geschichte, dass man irgendwie sich denkt, scheiße, wenn ich später irgendwann Demenz werde, dann brauche ich auf jeden Fall eine Patientenverfügung, damit die Leute mich umbringen. Weil so ein sauberner Haufen ohne Gedächtnis zu sein, da habe ich keinen Bock drauf und so.
So consciousness is the index in the memory database. Okay. But
ist der Controlling Agent, aber gut.
The questions of consciousness a little further. So we usually relate suffering to consciousness. So the capacity to suffer. I think to me that's a really strong sign of consciousness. Is a thing that can suffer.
Ja, besser Schisser. Das Problem ist doch aber eher, würde ich sagen, dass man das nicht mehr selber ist. Uns selbst zeichnet ja zum Beispiel, hat er ja gerade auch nochmal gesagt, die Tatsache aus, dass wir uns daran erinnern können, was wir gerade getan haben. Unsere ganze Persönlichkeit basiert auf diesem Index-Memory-Scheiß. Wenn du aber quasi, wenn das alles flöten geht, dann bist du nur noch ein Kurzzeitgedächtnis. Und weil du, und es ist ja auch so, dass übelst viele Demenzkranke wirklich die ganze Zeit nur noch frustriert sind und pissig und Leute die ganze Zeit anpumpen. Weil sie ja die ganze Zeit unzufrieden sind. Sie können ja überhaupt nichts mehr auflösen. Da ist ja nichts mehr kohärent dann irgendwie. Es gibt ja auch sozusagen, also ich denke, was uns vor allem zum Beispiel beruhigt, ist einen Plan zu haben. Irgendwas auf lange Sicht, auf kurze Sicht, auf mittlere Skala sich zu überlegen und dann irgendwie durchs Leben zu gehen und dabei immer von neuen Messdaten überrascht zu werden und so. Das ist ja alles wichtig. Wenn man aber irgendwie dement wird, dann geht das alles krachen.
How is that useful? Suffering. And like in your model, what you just described, which is indexing of memories and what is it, coherence with the perception, with this predictive thing that's going on in the perception. How does suffering relate to any of that? The higher level suffering that humans do.
Basically, pain is a reinforcement signal. Pain is a signal that one part of your brain sends to another part of your brain, or in an abstract sense, part of your mind sends to another part of the mind to regulate its behavior, to tell it the behavior that you're currently exhibiting should be improved. And this is the signal that I tell you to move away from what you're currently doing and push into a different direction. So pain gives you a part of you an impulse to do something differently. But sometimes this doesn't work because the training part of your brain is talking to the wrong region. Or because it has the wrong model of the relationships in the world. Maybe you're mismodeling yourself, or you're mismodeling the relationship of yourself to the world, or you're mismodeling the dynamics of the world. So you're trying to improve something that cannot be improved by generating more pain. Mm-hmm. But the system doesn't have any alternative. So it doesn't get better. What do you do if something doesn't get better and you want it to get better? You increase the strength of the signal. Mm-hmm. And when the signal becomes chronic, when it becomes permanent, without a change inside, this is what we call suffering. And the purpose of consciousness is to deal with contradictions, with things that cannot be resolved. The purpose of consciousness, I think, is similar to a conductor in an orchestra. Mm-hmm. When everything works well, the orchestra doesn't need much of a conductor as long as it's coherent. Mm-hmm. But when there is a lack of coherence or something is consistently producing disharmony and mismatches, then the conductor becomes a...
Exakt. Ne? Deswegen habe ich ja gesagt, das Ziel ist es, AFK zu gehen irgendwann. Ne, also eigentlich ist jedes Bewusstsein, möchte gerne irgendwann ins Nirvana gehen, weil es nicht mehr gebraucht wird. Es wird nur dann gebraucht, wenn Inputdaten reinkommen, die überraschend sind. Dann wird da Attention draufgelegt und dann ist man auch bewusst. Und ihr merkt das. Irgendwann in eurem Leben macht ihr so Routinen-Sachen und denkt nicht mehr drüber nach. Und dann wisst ihr auch gerade nicht, hab ich das jetzt gerade gemacht oder so? Das liegt daran, dass da keine bewusste Aktivität mehr stattgefunden hat. Ihr habt auf Autopilot irgendwas gemacht. Sowas wie einen Kühlschrank zumachen, Herd ausmachen und aus der Wohnung rausgehen und so. Korrekt, Handmuffel. Absolut korrekt.
Alert and interacts with it. So suffering attracts the activity of our consciousness. And the purpose of that is ideally that we bring new layers online, new layers of modeling that are able to create a model of the dysregulation. So we can deal with it.
Ja, so funktioniert ja nicht nur Kampfsport. So funktioniert ja jede Form von Muscle Memory. Zum Beispiel Instrumente spielen funktioniert genauso. Sprache lernen, ne? Alles, alle Lernprozesse funktionieren so. Ich denke ja nur noch in Higher Level Abstraction Layers. Ich denke ja nicht, ich werde jetzt meinen rechten Fuß bewegen und dann meinen linken und dann meinen rechten nach vorne und so, sondern ich denke mir, okay, ich laufe jetzt dahin. Das sind Higher-Level Abstraction Layers. Als Baby, wenn man das lernt, da denkt man noch über jeden Schritt einzeln nach. Beim Instrument denkst du über jeden Finger am Anfang einzeln nach, bis du irgendwann nur noch in Melodien denkst, weil der Rest sozusagen rudimentär unten drunter durchgeht. Und Muscle Memory, wissen wir ja alle aus Erfahrung, wird richtig gut eingespeichert ins Langzeitgedächtnis, wenn du schläfst. Am nächsten Tag und dieselbe Übung nochmal machst, kannst du es auf einmal automatisch besser. Sachen prägen sich über Schlafen auch viel besser ein.
And this means that we typically get higher level consciousness, so to speak, right? We get some consciousness above our pay grade, maybe, if we have some suffering early in our life. Most of the interesting people had trauma early on in their childhood. And trauma means that you are suffering an injury for which the system is not prepared, which it cannot deal with, which it cannot insulate itself from. So something breaks. And this means that the behavior of the system is permanently disturbed in a way that some mismatch exists now in the regulation, that just by following your impulses, by following the pain in the direction which it hurts, your situation doesn't improve but get worse. And so what needs to happen is that you grow up.
Yeah.
That's part that is grown up is able to deal with the part that is stuck in this earlier phase.
Yeah, so it leads to growth, you're adding extra layers to your cognition. Let me ask you then, because I got to stick on suffering, the ethics of the whole thing. So not our consciousness, but the consciousness of others. You've tweeted, one of my biggest fears is that insects could be conscious. The amount of suffering on Earth would be unthinkable. So
Ja.
when we think of other conscious beings, is suffering a property of consciousness that we're most concerned about? So I'm still thinking about robots, how to make sense of other non-human things that appear to have the depth of experience that humans have. And to me, that means consciousness and the darkest side of that, which is suffering, the capacity to suffer. And so I started thinking, how much responsibility do we have for those other conscious beings? That's where the definition of consciousness becomes most urgent. Like having to come up with a definition of consciousness becomes most urgent. Is who should we and should we not be torturing?
There's no general answer to this. Was Genghis Khan doing anything wrong? It depends, right, on how you look at it.
Well, he drew a line somewhere where this is us and that's them. It's the circle of empathy. It's like these, we don't have to use the word consciousness, but these are the things that matter to me if they suffer or not. And these are the things that don't matter to me.
Yeah, but when one of his commanders failed him, he broke his spine and let him die in a horrible way. And so in some sense, I think he was indifferent to suffering. Or he was not different in the sense that he didn't see it as useful if he inflicted suffering. But he did not see it as something that had to be avoided. That was not the goal. The question was, how can I use suffering and the infliction of suffering to reach my goals from his perspective?
I see. So like different societies throughout history put different value on the
different individuals, different psyches, right?
But also even the objective of avoiding suffering. Like some societies probably, I mean, this is where like religious belief really helps. That afterlife, that it doesn't matter that you suffer or die. What matters is you suffer honorably, right? So that you enter the afterlife.
It seems to be superstitious to me. Basically believes that assert things for which no evidence exists are incompatible with sound epistemology. And I don't think that religion has to be superstitious. Otherwise, it should be condemned in all cases.
You're somebody who's saying we live in a dream world. We have zero evidence for anything. So
no, it's not the case. There are limits to what languages can be constructed. Mathematics brings solid evidence for its own structure. And once we have some idea of what languages exist and how a system can learn and what learning itself is in the first place, and so on, we can begin to realize that our intuitions, that we are able to learn about the regularities of the world and minimize surprisal and understand the nature of our own agency to some degree of abstraction. That's not an illusion. So it's a useful approximation.
Just because we live in a dream world doesn't mean mathematics can't give us a consistent glimpse of objective reality.
We can basically distinguish useful encodings from useless encodings. And when we apply our truth seeking to the world, we know we usually cannot find out whether a certain thing is true. What we typically do is we take the state vector of the universe, separate it into separate objects that interact with each other, so interfaces. And this distinction that we are making is not completely arbitrary. It's done to optimize the compression that we can apply to our models of the universe. So we can predict what's happening with our limited resources. In this sense, it's not arbitrary. But the separation of the world into objects that are somehow discrete and interacting with each other is not the true reality, right?
Yeah.
The boundaries between the objects are projected into the world, not arbitrarily projected, but still, it's only an approximation of what's actually the case. And we sometimes notice...
Klar, weil die Molekülstruktur hier von dieser Oberfläche, die erschließt sich mir nicht, ne? Ich approximiere das hier einfach als eine glatte Fläche auf meinem Handy hier. Ne? Aber es ist in Wahrheit keine glatte Fläche, sondern es ist natürlich übelst krasse Oberfläche. Wenn man mit einem Elektronenmikroskop da drauf guckt, dann sieht man die auch. Ne? Und das ist eine Approximation. Das ist auch so ein, er hat ja auch gerade gesagt, Data Compression, ne? Data Compression ist übelst wichtig. Da sollte man öfter mal drüber nachdenken. Data Compression, er hat ja irgendwie angefangen, ich weiß nicht, ob er das im letzten Talk erzählt hatte, dass er da in Neuseeland diese eine Vorlesung von diesem Data Compression Typen hatte. Und das war ihm gar nicht so klar, dass das so krass ist, aber dann hat es ihm doch übelst was gebracht.
Is that we run into contradictions when we try to understand high-level things like economic aspects of the world and so on, or political aspects or psychological aspects, where we make simplifications and the objects that we are using to separate the world are just one of many possible projections of what's going on. And so it's not, in this postmodernist sense, completely arbitrary and you're free to pick what you want and dismiss what you don't like because it's all stories. No, that's not true. You have to show for every model of how well it predicts the world. So the confidence that you...
Nee, Vertrauen würde ich nicht sagen. Ist Data Compression, damit meine ich wirklich, es kommen viel mehr, also um das, was wir jetzt sozusagen wahrnehmen, wir imaginieren uns ja hier so eine Art Wahrnehmung her, ne? In Wahrheit nehmen wir viel weniger für unsere Daten, die in unseren Kopf reinkommen und verarbeitet werden, um das zu konstruieren, was wir hier sehen. Ne, da ist schon relativ viel Data Compression dabei, weil tatsächlich die Daten einfach zu viel wären für das Gehirn, um das zu verarbeiten. Ne, wir nehmen halt einfach an, wir leben in einer geometrischen Welt mit bestimmten Sachen, die wir schon oft beobachten konnten. Deswegen reicht uns ein kleiner Teil davon, den zu sehen, und dann können wir den Rest sozusagen aus unserer Data Compression raus extrapolieren. Wir haben halt Basisvektoren für Flaschen und so da. Und erst wenn wir neue Dinge sehen, die wir noch gar nicht gekannt haben, da müssen wir ständig hingucken, weil wir die Dinger erst lernen müssen. Also wir müssen quasi das Sehen lernen auch. Und ja, beim Hören ist es das Gleiche. Wir haben übelst viel Datakompression. Und dabei geht übrigens natürlich extrem viel Information verloren, ist ja klar.
you should have in the entities of your models should correspond to the evidence that you have.
Can I ask you on a small tangent to talk about your favorite set of ideas and people, which is postmodernism?
What?
What is postmodernism? How would you define it? And why, to you, is it not a useful framework of thought?
Postmodernism is something that I'm really not an expert on. And postmodernism is a set of philosophical ideas that is difficult to lump together, that is characterized by some useful thinkers, some of them post-structuralist and so on. And I'm mostly not interested in it because I think that it's not leading me anywhere that I find particularly useful. It's mostly, I think, born out of the insight that the ontologies that we impose on the world are not literally true, and that we can often get to a different interpretation by the world by using a different ontology, that is different separation of the world into interacting objects. Mm-hmm. But the idea that this makes the world a set of stories that are arbitrary, I think, is wrong. And the people that are engaging in this type of philosophy are working in an area that I largely don't find productive. There's nothing useful coming out of this. So this idea that truth is relative is not something that has in some sense informed physics or theory of relativity. And there is no feedback between those. There is no meaningful influence of this type of philosophy on the sciences or on engineering or on politics. But there is a very strong information on ideology. Because it basically has become an ideology that is justifying itself by the notion that truth is a relative concept. And it's not being used in such a way that the philosophers or sociologists that take up these ideas say, I should doubt my own ideas because maybe my separation of the world into objects is not completely valid, and I should maybe use a different one and be open to a pluralism of ideas. But it mostly exists to dismiss the ideas of other people.
It becomes a political weapon of sorts to achieve power.
Basically, there's nothing wrong, I think, with developing a philosophy around this, but to develop norms around the idea that truth is something that is completely negotiable is incompatible with the scientific project. And I think if the academia has no defense against the ideological parts of the postmodernist movement, it's doomed.
Right. You have to acknowledge the ideological part of any movement, actually, including postmodernism.
Well, the question is what an ideology is. And to me, an ideology is basically a viral memeplex that is changing your mind in such a way that reality gets warped. It gets warped in such a way that you're being cut off from the rest of human thought space. And you cannot consider things outside of the range of ideas of your own ideology as possibly true.
Right. So, I mean, there's certain properties to an ideology that make it harmful. One of them is that, like, dogmatism of just certainty, dogged certainty in that you're right, you have the truth, and nobody else does.
But what is creating the certainty? It's very interesting to look at the type of model that is being produced. Is it basically just a strong prior, and you tell people, this idea that you consider to be very true, the evidence for this is actually just much weaker than you thought, and look here at some studies. No, this is not how it works. It's usually normative, which means some thoughts are unthinkable because they would change your identity into something that is no longer acceptable. And this cuts you off from considering an alternative. And many de facto religions use this trick to lock people into a certain mode of thought. And this removes agency over your own thoughts. And it's very ugly to me. It's basically not just a process of domestication, but it's actually an intellectual castration that happens. It's an inability to think creatively and to bring forth new thoughts.
Can I ask you about chemical substances that affect the video game, the dream world? So psychedelics that increasingly have been getting a lot of research done on them. So in general, psychedelics, psilocybin, MDMA, but also a really interesting one, the big one, which is DMT. What and where are the places that these substances take the mind that is operating in the
gleich wieder
dream
von
world?
Pachamama, ne?
Do you have an interesting sense how this throws a wrinkle into the prediction model? Is it just some weird little quirk, or is there some fundamental expansion of the mind going on?
I suspect that a way to look at psychedelics is that they induce particular types of lucid dreaming states. So it's a state in which certain connections are being severed in your mind. They're no longer active. Your mind basically gets free to move in a certain direction because some particular inhibition doesn't work anymore. And as a result, you might stop having a self, or you might stop perceiving the world as three-dimensional. And you can explore that state. And I suppose that for every state that can be induced with psychedelics, there are people that are naturally in that state. So sometimes psychedelics just shift you through a range of possible mental states, and they can also shift you out of the range of permissible mental states, that is, where you can make predictive models of reality. And what I observe in people that use psychedelics a lot is that they tend to be overfitting. Overfitting means that you are using more bits for modeling the dynamics of a function than you should. And so you can fit your curve to extremely detailed things in the past, but this model is no longer predictive for the future.
What is it about psychedelics that forces that? I thought it would be the opposite. I thought that it's a good mechanism for generalization, for regularization. So it feels like psychedelics expansion of the mind, like taking you outside of, like forcing your model to be non-predictive is a good thing. Meaning like it's almost like, okay, what I would say psychedelics are akin to is traveling to a totally different environment. Like going, if you've never been to like India or something like that from the United States, very different set of people, different culture, different food, different roads and values and all those kinds of things.
Yeah,
It's
so
traveling.
psychedelics can, for instance, teleport people into a universe that is hyperbolic, which means that
Yeah.
if you imagine a room that you're in, you can turn around 360 degrees and you didn't go full circle. You need to go 720 degrees to
Yeah.
go full circle.
Exactly.
So the things that people learn in that state cannot be easily transferred in this universe that we are in. It could be that if they're able to abstract and understand what happened to them, that they understand that some part of their spatial cognition has been desynchronized and has found a different synchronization. And this different synchronization happens to be a hyperbolic one, right? So you learn something interesting about your brain. It's difficult to understand what exactly happened, but we get a pretty good idea once we understand how the brain is representing geometry.
Yeah, but doesn't it give you a fresh perspective on the physical reality? Who's making that sound? Is it inside my head?
Sie sitzen in irgendeinem Hotelraum, ne? In irgendeiner Hotellobby. Also in irgendeinem Hotelzimmer wahrscheinlich.
Or is it external?
Well, there is no sound outside of your mind, but it's making sense of phenomena in physics.
Yeah, in the physical reality, there's sound waves traveling through air. Okay,
That's our model of what happened.
that's about what happened, right?
So-
Don't psychedelics give you a fresh perspectives on this physical reality, like on not this physical reality, but this more what do you call the dream world? That's
So
mapped directly
The
to
purpose of dreaming at night, I think, is
yeah
data
that's right.
augmentation.
Well, exactly. So
So you
that's very
basically
different. That's very similar to psychedelics.
exchange
Right?
parameters about the things that you have learned. And for instance, when you are young, you have seen things from certain perspectives, but not from others.
Yeah.
So your
Jetzt kommt
brain
das
is
mit dem Fliegen,
generating
ne?
new perspectives of objects that you already know, which means they can learn to recognize them later from different perspectives. And I suspect that's the reason why many of us remember to have flying dreams as children, because it's just different perspectives of the world that we already know, and that it starts to generate these different perspective changes, and then it fluidly turns this into a flying dream to make sense of what's happening, right? So you fill in the gaps, and suddenly you see yourself flying. And similar things can happen with semantic relationships. So it's not just spatial relationships, but it can also be the relationships between ideas that are being changed. And it seems that the mechanisms that make that happen during dreaming are interacting with these same receptors that are being stimulated by psychedelics. So I suspect that there is a thing that I haven't read really about. The way in which dreams are induced in the brain is not just that the activity of the brain gets tuned down because you are somehow your eyes are closed and you no longer get enough data from your eyes, but there is a particular type of neurotransmitter that is saturating your brain during these phases, during the REM phases, and you produce controlled hallucinations. And psychedelics are linking into these mechanisms, I suspect.
So isn't that another trickier form of data augmentation?
Yes, but it's also data augmentation that can happen outside of the specification that your brain is tuned to. So basically, people are overclocking their brains, and that produces states that are subjectively extremely interesting,
Aber unmöglich.
but from the outside, very suspicious.
So I think I'm over applying the metaphor of a neural network in my own mind, which I just think that doesn't lead to overfitting, right? But But you were just sort of anecdotally saying my experiences with people that have done psychedelics or that kind of quality.
I think it typically happens. So if you look at people like Timothy Leary, and he has written beautiful manifestos about the effect of LSD on.
Also sicherlich fährt da was runter beim Gehirn, ganz einfach deswegen, weil viel weniger Daten reinkommen. Im Prinzip kommen ja gar keine Daten mehr rein, nur noch ganz wenige, ne? Das heißt, der Dateninput ist sozusagen kleiner. Aber der Part des Gehirns, der sozusagen Geschichten erzählt, der wird noch aktiv sein.
People. He genuinely believed, he writes in these manifestos, that in the future, science and art will only be done on psychedelics because it's so much more efficient and so much better. And he gave LSD to children in his community of a few thousand people that he had near San Francisco. And basically, he was losing touch with reality. He did not understand the effects that the things that he was doing would have on the reception of psychedelics by society, because he was unable to think critically about what happened. What happened was that he got in a euphoric state. Mm-hmm. That euphoric state happened because he was overfitting. He was taking this sense of euphoria and translating it into a model of actual success in the world. Right? He was feeling better. Limitations had disappeared that he experienced to be existing, but he didn't get superpowers.
I understand what you mean by overfitting now. There's a lot of interpretation to the term overfitting in this case, but I got you. So he was getting positive rewards from a lot of actions that he shouldn't have been.
But not just this. So if you take, for instance, John Lilly, who was studying dolphin languages and aliens and so on, a lot of people that used psychedelics became very loopy. And the typical thing that you notice when people are on psychedelics is that they are in a state where they feel that everything can be explained now. Everything is clear. Everything is obvious.
Yeah.
And sometimes they have indeed discovered a useful connection, but not always. Very often these connections are overinterpretations.
I wonder,
ich bin nicht gemutet.
There's a question of correlation versus causation. And also I wonder if it's the psychedelics or if it's more the social, like being the outsider and having a strong community of outside and having a leadership position in an outsider cult-like community, that could have a much stronger effect of overfitting than do psychedelics themselves, the actual substances, because it's a counterculture thing. So it could be that as opposed to the actual substance. If you're a boring...
Also diese Sache, dass man sozusagen denkt, man hat die geilsten, krassesten Ideen. Jetzt verstehe ich das auch, was er mit dem Overfitting meint, ne?
Person who wears a suit and tie and works at a bank and takes psychedelics, that could be a very different effect of psychedelics on your mind. I'm just sort of raising the point that the people you referenced are already weirdos. I'm not sure exactly.
Oh, no, not necessarily. A lot of the people that tell me that they use psychedelics in a useful way started out as squares and were liberating themselves because they were stuck. They were basically stuck in local optimum of their own self-model, of their relationship to the world, and suddenly they had data augmentation. They basically saw and experienced a space of possibilities. They experienced what it would be like to be another person.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they took important lessons from that experience back home.
Yeah, I mean, I love the metaphor of data augmentation because that's been the primary driver of self-supervised learning in the computer vision domain is data augmentation. So it's funny to think of data like chemically induced data augmentation in the human mind.
There's also a very interesting effect that I noticed. I know several people who swear to me that LSD has cured their migraines. So severe cluster headaches or migraines that didn't respond to standard medication that disappeared after a single dose. And I don't recommend anybody doing this, especially not in the US where it's illegal. And there are no studies on this for that reason. But it seems that anecdotally that it basically can reset the serotonergic system. So it's basically pushing them outside of their normal boundaries. And as a result, it needs to find a new equilibrium. And in some people, that equilibrium is better. But it also follows that in other people, it might be worse. So if you have a brain that is already teetering on the boundary to psychosis, it can be permanently pushed over that boundary.
Well, that's why you have to do good science, which they're starting to do on all these different substances of how well it actually works for the different conditions. Like MDMA seems to help with PTSD. Same with
Hat der nicht
psilocybin.
immer Timestamps hier
That,
drin?
you know, you need to do good science, meaning
Warum sind
large
die hier nicht
studies of
angezeigt?
large N.
Yeah, so based
All
on
that
the
kind of
existing
Was ist das
studies
für eine
with
Scheiße?
MDMA,
Das Ding ist 35. Okay. Sie kommen gleich zu GPT-3.
it seems that
Dann-
if you look at Rick Doblin's work and what he has published about this and talks about, MDMA seems to be a psychologically relatively safe drug, but it's physiologically
LSD
not
hat dein
very safe.
Schlafwandeln
That
abgestellt?
is, there
Okay.
is neurotoxicity if you would use a too large dose, and if you combine this with alcohol, which a lot of kids do in party settings during raves and so on, it's
Mit Drogen das System aus einem aktuellen Arbeitspunkt rausschubsen und hoffen, dass es danach besser in ein anderes Optimum reinkonvergiert, ist keine schlechte Idee. Ne? Also, das ist so ein bisschen wie Stimulated Annealing. Ne? Wenn man das System so ein bisschen aufwärmt, alle States so ein bisschen fishy macht, alles so ein bisschen mehr Temperatur ins System reinbringt, um zu gucken, ob dann eine andere Lösung gefunden wird und so.
very hepatotoxic. So basically, you can kill your liver. And this means that it's probably something that is best and most productively used in a clinical setting by people who really know what they're doing. And I suspect that's also true for the other psychedelics. That is, while the other psychedelics are probably not as toxic as, say, alcohol, the effects on the psyche can be much more profound and lasting.
Yeah. Well, as far as I know, psilocybin, so mushrooms, magic mushrooms, as far as I know, in terms of the studies they're running, I think have they're allowed to do what they're calling heroic doses. So that one does not have a toxicity. So they could do like huge doses in a clinical setting when they're doing study on psilocybin, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, it seems that most of the psychedelics work in extremely small doses,
Yeah.
which means that the effect on the rest of the body is relatively low. And MDMA is probably the exception. Maybe ketamine can be dangerous in larger doses because it can depress breathing and so on. But the LSD and psilocybin work in very, very small doses, at least the active part of them. Of psilocybin, LSD is only the active part. And but the effect that it can have on your mental wiring can be very dangerous, I think.
Let's talk about AI a little bit.
Okay. Jetzt geht das GPT-Gebabbel los, ne? GPT-3, GPT-4, was ja zu dem Zeitpunkt noch nicht veröffentlicht war, ne? Und da kommt dann wieder der Spruch von wegen GPT-4 hört uns jetzt gerade zu und so, ne? Das machen wir beim nächsten Mal. Jetzt ist 0 Uhr. Der Boy ist auch müde. Ich speichere mir hier ab, wo wir waren. Da, ich speichere es mir ab. Ich tue es in einen Textfile. 6x. So. Und der Boy muss jetzt ins Bettchen. Wir gucken mal, wen wir reden. Ab ins Bettchen. Ja. Leider geht das nicht. Ich kann Erwin nicht reden, weil der hat einen Raidschutz drin, nehme ich an. Ja, dann halt Onyx Chan.